I swore I would take this secret to the grave. But after everything I saw, after that day with Obama, I realized the world needs to know what happened between us. If you believe that there are encounters capable of changing the course of a continent, stay with me until the end. Subscribe to the channel now, because this story has never been told like this, and perhaps never will again. It all started on an ordinary morning in Ouagadougou. The sun hadn't yet fully risen, but my phone was already vibrating insistently. When I saw the name on the screen, my heart stopped for a second. It was an encrypted line from Geneva. On the other end, a voice I hadn't heard for a long time told me bluntly, "He wants to see you." Discreetly. In Accra. And before I could respond, the line went dead. For a few seconds I stood still, staring into space. I knew exactly who he was. There was no need to say the name. And the most surprising thing was not the invitation, but the timing. Africa was about to cross a new threshold, and perhaps there was only a thread of balance left holding back the chaos. Perhaps, at that very moment, destiny was being silently rewritten. I confess I hesitated. There were things I needed to resolve, delicate moves underway, fragile alliances sustained by promises. But something inside me told me that this meeting could not be ignored. An ancient part of me, perhaps more intuitive than strategic, understood that certain opportunities do not ask for permission. They just arrive, and change everything. As I organized my trip in absolute secrecy, a part of me struggled with anxiety. What kind of conversation awaited me? Would it be a political dialogue? A moral appeal? Or perhaps an attempt to persuade me? I had faced heads of state, CEOs of conglomerates, generals, but nothing compared to the prospect of facing Barack Obama face to face. I decided to take only the essentials with me. No entourage, no advisors, no apparatus. I wanted it to be something real, human, without masks. And deep down, I sensed that he expected that too. The simplicity of the gesture was part of the strength of that moment. Two men. A conversation. And perhaps, a new path for millions of lives. The flight was silent. Even surrounded by discreet bodyguards, I felt a different, dense loneliness. As if each cloud we crossed carried within it the questions that weighed on me. I thought about the young people in Bobo Dioulasso, the forgotten peasants, the mothers who still walked for hours to find a bit of clean water. What could he see when he looked at Africa? When I landed in Accra, night was already taking over the sky. A simple car was waiting for me, with tinted windows and a foreign driver. We drove through quiet streets until we reached a house hidden among palm trees, far from the diplomatic centers. There, I got out, and before I could even knock on the door, it opened. And there he was. A restrained smile, a direct gaze. Barack Obama. He didn't say a word immediately. He just reached out to me firmly and respectfully. His eyes, however, said much more than his gestures. There was an ancient weight about them, like that of someone who has seen what others prefer not to see. And in that moment, I realized that this was not a casual encounter. It was something carefully planned. We entered the house. Everything was simple, almost austere, as if the space itself demanded humility. We sat across from each other, a small table between us. A teapot was still steaming, but no one touched the cups. The silence was thick, almost symbolic. As if every second there was filled with untold stories, postponed decisions, swallowed truths. He was the first to speak. His voice was low but firm. He said he had been watching me for some time, that he had read every word, every speech, every decision I had made. "You are doing what no one else has had the courage to do. But it comes at a price," he said. And at that moment, my breath caught for a second. It was strange to hear that coming from his mouth. It wasn't flattery. There was a warning in his words. Obama wasn't there to flatter me, he wanted to warn me. About the risks. About the unseen forces at work when someone tries to change the rules. He spoke of silent coups, subtle sabotage, diplomatic pressure masquerading as aid. And I knew every word was true. I remained silent. I listened attentively, letting his experience weigh down on my youth like a mountain. He did not speak as a politician. He spoke as a man. As someone who has felt the loneliness of power, who knows the faces of traitors, and who, despite this, still dreams. Yes, there was a dream in his eyes. A wounded dream, but not dead. When I finally spoke, I was blunt. I asked him why he was there. Why he had called me. Why now? He took a deep breath, looked up at the ceiling as if seeking courage, and said, "Because you still have something that I lost along the way. Something that can save this continent." And in that moment, I knew that this night would change everything. It wasn't about politics, Mariana. It was about the soul. About the spirit of a people that had been crushed for centuries, but that still pulsed. Obama didn't see me as a head of state, but as a guardian of something greater. Something that not even he could protect. And so he needed to give me everything he knew, before it was too late. He leaned forward slightly, as if to bridge the gap between our stories. "You need to understand what's coming," he said. And then he began to talk about things I had only heard in whispers. Documents that had never reached the press, operations conducted in the shadows, agreements made in corridors where democracy is not allowed. He told me about the closed meetings with European leaders, where Africa was treated as territory to be balanced, not as home to living peoples. "They don't want you dead. Only your immobility," he said. And I felt a lump in my throat. It was as if every step we took toward autonomy set off an alarm in the palaces of the North. He told me about how, at the beginning of his term, he tried to give Africa back something that had been stolen from it, dignity. But he discovered, the hard way, that certain systems cannot be moved by speeches. That there are forces so deep-rooted, so skillful, that they make good seem dangerous. "I am not cynical, but I am no longer innocent either," he confessed. Then he took from his pocket a small, dark-covered, worn notebook filled with handwritten notes. "It's all here," he said, sliding it to the center of the table. "What they let me know, what I discovered, and what I never dared to publish." I touched the notebook as if holding a sacred artifact. Inside was part of his soul, and now, part of my future. "You have allies you don't even know exist yet," he continued. "But you also have enemies disguised as applause." That hit me hard. How many smiles have surrounded me in the corridors of power, when deep down there was poison in the sweet words? It was time to look at everything again. To review every name, every gesture. He asked me not to trust anyone blindly, not even well-known figures in the African struggle. "Some have sold themselves through silence," he said, with bitterness in his eyes. It was a harsh but necessary warning. And then I realized what he really wanted, not to save me, but to prepare me. For a kind of war that you don't see in the newspapers. As he spoke, I saw something in him that I never imagined, vulnerability. It wasn't weakness. It was the weight of someone who tried to fight a monster and came out alive, but scarred. And in that moment, I promised myself, I won't be just another name in history. If he gave me this burden, I will carry it until the end. After hours of talking, he stood up. He walked over to an inconspicuous bookshelf, took out a small antique globe, and slowly turned it. "Everything is changing faster than they can control it," he said. "But that's also dangerous. A power vacuum can devour the righteous themselves." That stuck in my mind like a persistent echo. He then turned and said something unexpected. "Maybe it's time for you to create your own NATO." I smiled, thinking he was joking. But he continued, seriously. "Not military. Spiritual, cultural, strategic. An alliance with African roots, far from Western eyes." At that moment, something inside me clicked. As if he had named a dream I hadn't yet known I had. We began to scribble ideas on napkins, hastily drawn mind maps, invisible pathways of influence that we could activate. He spoke of universities, religious leaders, artists, peasants. Real, living people who could form a fabric of resistance beyond the palaces. "The war of the future will not be of tanks, but of symbols," he said. I felt that it wasn't just a suggestion. It was a legacy. Something that he couldn't do, but that now he saw in me a real chance of being born. And because of that, I couldn't fail. That night was no longer about the two of us. It was about centuries of silence and centuries of hope that could touch each other there, at that table. He told me how young Africans were the key. But not just those studying in the capitals, especially those living on the margins, forgotten by the big NGOs, the cameras, and the reports. It all starts with them, he kept saying. And I knew he was right. The invisible ones are the ones who carry the power that no one notices. As the night wore on, I began to realize that this meeting was more than strategic. It was almost spiritual. As if two consciousnesses had been summoned by something greater, for a time that has not yet been born. And I felt that all of Africa, in silence, was breathing around us. Before he could say anything else, silence surrounded us again. And there, without words, we knew, there was a plan. Not complete, not guaranteed, but pulsing. And this plan had to be guarded, nurtured, protected, until the right time to blossom. Just before dawn, he led me to the garden at the back of the house. The city was still asleep, and the sky was beginning to lighten. This is where I made important decisions when I was a young senator, he said, looking at the trees as if searching for answers in time. I just listened. I didn't want to interrupt that sacred moment. He handed me a small, sealed wooden box. Don't open it yet, he said. You'll know when the time comes. I didn't ask what was inside. Part of me wanted to keep the mystery alive. Sometimes what sustains a mission is not certainty but faith that there is something greater waiting at the end of the road. We parted without promises. Just a firm look, a handshake, a respect sealed in silence. He didn't say good luck. He didn't say go with God. He just said, take care of the fire. And those 3 words resonated with me more than any speech I've ever heard at the UN, the African Union, or in the newspapers. I returned to the car with my soul stirred. He was not the same man who had landed in Accra. Something in me had been touched, awakened, perhaps even consecrated. I tried to sleep on the flight back, but the words, the maps, the symbols, everything kept spinning around in my head. I had a mission, but I didn't know how to accomplish it yet. When I arrived in Ouagadougou, I went straight to my office, without taking a break. The sun was rising, and the city was beginning to pulsate. But I felt as if I were carrying a new Africa inside my chest. Not the one of the pretty speeches, but the real, deep, ancestral Africa. The one that resists. The one that is reborn. I opened my notebook and began to write. I sketched the first version of a silent, non-institutional, but living Pan-African network. Secret meetings, emotional education, spiritual sovereignty. A movement that does not depend on external financiers. An awakening that begins in the hearts before reaching the flags. That same week, I began conversations with grassroots leaders, forgotten teachers, activists who had never won awards. And little by little, I felt something was beginning to blossom. It wasn't a project. It was a flame. And it had begun, that night, in that garden, in that encounter with a man the whole world thought they knew. A few days after my return, I noticed that something was changing around me. Emails were not delivered, meetings were cancelled without explanation. Voices that had previously surrounded me with enthusiasm now hesitated. As if someone had turned on a light somewhere, and shadows began to move. The resistance, even if silent, had already begun. I noticed that certain foreign diplomats began to look at me differently. Not with distrust, but with fear. As if they knew something had been awakened. As if they realized that, perhaps, I wasn't so predictable anymore. It was subtle, but clear. And for me, this was a sign that the meeting with Obama had not been just symbolic. I went back to his notebook several times. Some of the notes made me uneasy. There were names of social programs that, behind the charity, hid million-dollar extractions. Outsourcing schemes that handed over natural resources to invisible consortiums. Everything was recorded with precision, as if he knew that one day someone would have the courage to confront these ghosts. I met with my closest advisors. I didn't tell them everything, not yet. But I shared my vision for a new network, a way to rebuild the African spirit away from formal tables. Some laughed, others kept quiet. but 2 or 3 understood. And with them, I began to build something new, even if quietly, even if at risk. Every decision, from then on, began to carry a double weight. The visible one, which the newspapers would report. And the invisible one, which prepared the ground for what was to come. We began mapping authentic voices, natural leaders in remote villages, young people creating solutions with almost no resources. It was in them that I saw the future and the real danger of it all. Because when a people awakens from within, there is no army that can stop them. And those in power know this. That is why the pressure began to intensify. Calls for international dialogues, suggestions for external consultancies, smiling invitations that hid traps. I smiled too. But now, with a different awareness. The night I spent with Obama became more present with each passing day. Not as a memory, but as a guide. I replayed his words in my mind like someone reciting a secret chant. And with each step I took, I felt that he was with me not as a former president, but as a brother in cause. As an invisible sentinel of a silent revolution. On a visit to the interior of the country, I met a girl named Adama. She was 8 years old, barefoot, with eyes that could see the universe. She looked at me as if she had known me for a long time, as if she knew what I carried. "You are what you dream, right?" she asked. That took me apart. Because no one had ever said something so direct to me. We talked for a few minutes, and she told me how she taught other children to sing her grandmother's old songs. Songs that spoke of roots, of rain, of respect for the earth. She said that when they sang together, the trees swayed more strongly. I believed her. Because there was an ancestral, pure, unbreakable force there. As if Africa were speaking through her mouth. That night, I cried. Alone, in silence, like a man who carries more than he can bear. Adama reminded me of why this was all happening. It wasn't about geopolitics. It wasn't about power. It was about soul. It was about giving children back the chance to grow up unapologetically who they are. It was about freeing the song that lies dormant in our roots. I sent a letter to Obama telling him about Adama. He replied in a few words, "She is the answer." And I knew exactly what he meant. The revolution is not in the summits. It is in the fields. In the makeshift schools. In the drums that still beat, even when no one is listening. The rebirth of Africa begins with them. I began to think about an invisible safety net for children like Adama. Not a government program. But something organic. A web of caregivers, of storytellers, of silent teachers who could nurture these little beacons. It was bold, it was slow, but it was real. And most of all, it was necessary. I proposed secret meetings between wise men and young people, away from the cameras, away from formalities. Some began to happen on full moon nights, like in the old villages. And there, without needing titles, I saw men and women rekindling what never died. Culture was pulsating again, not as a spectacle, but as breathing. Adama never knew it, but she inspired an entire movement. Her innocence was prophetic. And when people ask me where my strength comes from, I think of her. Her eyes. Her songs. And her question, "You are what you dream, right?" Yes, Adama. And now I fight for the dream to become reality. One morning, I received a white envelope with no return address. Inside was just a photo of me, taken from a distance, and a handwritten sentence, "You're going too far." I took a deep breath. It was a clear sign that the walls were closing in. But there was no way back. Not after everything I had seen, heard, and carried. I notified my security team, but asked for a full description. I didn't want any fuss. The more noise we make, the more we distract from what matters. I already knew that by touching such deep structures, I would not only spark debate. It would awaken monsters. And monsters don't like mirrors. And that was exactly what my work was beginning to do, reflect what they hide. I also received a call from an old ally. Her voice was shaking. She said that some funders had withdrawn support from social projects linked to the government. Not for lack of results, but for misalignment of values. That was the code. The silent punishment was beginning. And with it, the real test of my faith in this path. I gathered my little council together again. He said that if we needed to, we would forego all external financing. But we would not give up dignity. Not even the truth. Some hesitated. Others were moved. And there, I understood that loyalty does not come from politics. It is born from the bond. The courage to look someone in the eye and say, "I'm still here." We began to organize even more private meetings. We used ancient codes, forgotten signals. Africa, which had resisted colonization for centuries, also knew how to resist modern manipulation. We discovered supply routes, parallel communication networks, and created our own spiritual alert system. Yes, spiritual. Because some battles cannot be won with reason alone. The threats became more frequent. But unexpected alliances also began to emerge. Tribal leaders, religious leaders, old rivals, they all felt that something new was being born. It was as if their fear was no longer greater than their hope. And when that happens, when hope overcomes fear, something is ignited. Something that can no longer be extinguished. At that time, I thought a lot about Obama. How he must have faced similar pressures on a global scale. And I realized that he had never had an entire continent calling him by name the way they were calling me now. And that was when I understood, I am not just a man. I am the voice of a memory that will not sleep anymore. While the world continued with its standardized reports, forums and speeches, we were building something else. Slowly, silently, deeply rooted. A living network, made up of ordinary people, who carried within themselves the knowledge of their grandmothers and the fury of their grandchildren. A movement without an official name, but with such a strong identity that no one could deny its existence. We began connecting midwives, farmers, village teachers, artisans, healers, street musicians. People that big projects ignore. And the closer we got to them, the more I realized that we weren't creating something new, we were just dusting off what had always existed. Africa didn't need to be invented anew. It just needed to be heard. We created listening groups, sharing spaces where we didn't talk about money, but about legacy. Not about contracts, but about purpose. People who had never seen each other began to feel like they were part of something bigger. An invisible thread connected everything. And each encounter was like rekindling an ancient fire, buried under centuries of imposed silence. I let decisions come from below. I did not lead as a boss, but as a seed. And I soon realized that the further I retreated, the more the network grew. The wisdom of the people is like water, when it finds space, it flows naturally. And that was exactly what scared those who watched us, they couldn't control something that had no owner. We began to send messages in the form of folk songs, embroidery, and ancient proverbs. A verse here, a symbol there. It was as if we were creating a secret language, ours alone. Those who could read, read it. Those who couldn't, found folklore. And that protected us. Because culture has always been our greatest weapon, even when no one else realized it. Some international NGOs tried to infiltrate us, offering support. But the network reacted like a living organism. It recognized when the intention was control disguised as aid. And it shut down. Not with hostility, but with dignity. Our response was silence. And in that silence, we began to build a new form of sovereignty. I had been dreaming of this moment ever since the meeting in Accra. But to see it come to life, it was different. It was real. It was Africa, with all its scars and glories, saying, "We are still here. And if we are here, then the future is still ours. And no one, no matter how powerful, can take that away from us." The news came on a Sunday morning. One of the greatest Western powers had made an official statement against the recent nationalist and anti-democratic movements emerging in Africa. They didn't say my name, but they said everything. That speech was about us. About me. About the network they could no longer contain. Soon after, the biased headlines began, the distorted reports, the usual experts appearing to explain what they do not experience. They said I was radicalizing, that I dissuaded investment, that I was authoritarian. But the people knew. I knew that what moved us was not hate, it was longing. I miss belonging, deciding, breathing without asking permission. Obama wrote to me again. This time, a short, direct letter, now is the time. I kept those words in my heart like someone who keeps a sacred code. And I understood that confrontation was inevitable. Not with weapons, but with truth. And truth, when it explodes, does not retreat. It transforms. And frightens. We began publishing forgotten documents, revealing old agreements, exposing contracts that should never have existed. But we did it carefully. Without resentment, without spectacularization. Just showing. Just counting. Because when the truth appears calmly, it hurts more deeply. It disarms cynicism and leaves accomplices naked before their own choices. The population reacted with a lucidity that moved me. Young people filled the squares to read ancient texts, danced to forbidden rhythms, and sew flags with rescued symbols. It was as if we had broken a spell. As if the whole of Africa was coming out of a deep sleep and, upon opening its eyes, said, "Never again." The embassies began to move. Urgent meetings, notes of repudiation, attempts to create internal divisions. But it was too late. The flame had spread. What started as a seed was now a forest. And the sound of the leaves rustling in the wind was louder than the sound of any bomb. That night, I sat alone on the palace terrace. I looked at the sky and gave thanks. Not for victory, because it was still far away. But for courage. For fidelity to the calling. For meeting a man who, years before, made me see what no one else dared to show. And with the certainty that history was finally changing hands. It was a warm, quiet morning when the phone rang. On the other end, a familiar voice said, "He's coming." I didn't need to ask who. Obama was returning to Africa. But this time, not as a former president. Not as a symbol. But as a witness that something was happening, something that even the books were not prepared to record. We organized the meeting in secret. No coverage. No photographers. Just an old room, made of clay and wood, in the heart of a village forgotten by everyone, except us. There, we sat again. The same eyes. The same respect. But now, with something new between us, time. And time had proven him right. He looked around, saw the children playing with ancestral words, saw the men planting without pesticides, saw the women exchanging recipes for resistance. And he smiled. "You did what I only imagined," he said. I shook my head. We did. Because this story has no lone heroes. It has echoes, it has currents, it has legacies. We talked for hours, without rushing. He told me about his life after the White House, about the scars that still throb, about the dreams that persist. And I listened to him as if I were listening to time talking. Because Obama was no longer a political figure. He was a man who saw from within what few suspect. And who, even so, did not give up on dreaming. When we said goodbye, he hugged me tightly. It wasn't formality. It was gratitude. It was relief. It was a passing of the baton. Keep going. And protect this with everything you have, he said. And I promised. Not with words. But with my eyes. With my whole heart. Because now I knew, what we had built could no longer be erased. As he walked away, children surrounded him, laughing, tugging at his hand. And I saw in his eyes a light I hadn't seen since that first night in Accra. The light of someone who knows that the seed fell on good soil. That it sprouted. And that the world, sooner or later, will have to hear what grew from it. That afternoon, I sat under an old tree and closed my eyes. I heard the sounds of the village, felt the wind in the branches, and realized that the future finally had a new sound. It wasn't the sound of guns. It was the sound of footsteps. Firm, slow, determined steps, towards an Africa that is finally starting to walk for you. It didn't take long for the winds to change. Neighboring countries began sending encrypted messages, asking for private meetings. Some leaders wanted to understand what was happening. Others just felt it. There was no way to ignore it anymore. Africa was generating something that escaped conventional logic. Something that was not born in offices, but in the soul. I received formal invitations to lectures, forums, councils, all requiring me to explain the new African leadership approach. But I refused. Because what is alive cannot be explained in a PowerPoint. What pulses does not fit into a protocol. And what we are doing is too visceral to be translated into diplomatic language. Instead, we began sending messengers, local leaders who spoke with their bodies, with dance, with story. They crossed borders on foot, with drums and seeds in their backpacks. And wherever they went, they awakened something. Sometimes a memory, sometimes a tear. But always, a desire to reconnect with something forgotten. They were old women and young men. They were cattle herders and urban poets. They all spoke the same invisible language, that of dignity. That of the land that no longer accepts being sold as merchandise. That of bodies that are tired of lowering their heads to those who have never seen them as human. The silent cry of a continent in rebirth. We began to see signs of change. Schools that revived extinct languages. Rituals that were once again practiced with reverence. Children who no longer wanted to be Western but something new, something deeply African, deeply free. And all this without propaganda, without posters, without slogans. It was as if something ancient had awakened. Some academics tried to give names to what was happening. Grassroots Afrofuturism. Decolonial spirituality. Intuitive governance. I smiled. Because what was emerging was not a concept. It was a consequence. Of encounters, of pain, of long silences that now wanted to speak. And when people speak, no theory can explain everything. The network had become a wave. And now, this wave was reaching places that the political map had never reached. Because the heart of a people is bigger than any border. And once awakened, it never goes back to sleep. The first time I heard the new song, I was passing through a forgotten village in the north. A boy, sitting on a rock, sang to himself. The melody was ancient, but the verses were new. They spoke of sovereignty, of dreams, of agreements that no one else would agree to sign. And that paralyzed me. Because it was beautiful. And it was dangerous. I asked who had taught me that song. He said, it came from the wind. I felt a shiver. Because, in a way, it was true. No one was in control of what was emerging anymore. Consciousness had escaped the control of any central leadership. Now it walked alone. In the form of music, of gesture, of gaze. We began to hear variations of the same song in different villages. Each region adapted the rhythm, the tone, the verses. But the spirit was the same. It was a soundtrack of liberation. Not aggressive, but firm. A collective voice saying, our time has come. And we will no longer ask for permission to exist. This scared a lot of people. Suddenly, international authorities began to propose cultural cooperation agreements. Desperate attempts to shape that which could no longer be shaped. But it was too late. Because you don't negotiate with a people who learn to sing with their own scars. We then decided to organize the first meeting of living voices. Not in a capital. But in an open field, under a baobab tree. Thousands came, without prior warning, without formal summons. They came because something inside them said, now. And that day, we heard the music of the new Africa. Not with ears, but with the chest. We recorded everything, but never published it. Because it wasn't a show. It was sacred. A pact made in songs, in dances, in silence. And I knew, in that moment, that we had reached the point of no return. What began in a room with Obama now echoed through drums, through boys' voices and stones. There was nothing left to prove. The continent had spoken. And the world was beginning to listen. But no rebirth comes without pain. And one moonless dawn, they came. Unidentified troops invaded one of our newly created cultural centers. They burned books, destroyed instruments, silenced songs. It was brutal. And it was symbolic. A clear attempt to kill the seed while it was still in the bud. I got the news before dawn. I felt crushed. As if something had been ripped out of my chest. For the first time in many months, I thought about giving up. Because seeing beauty destroyed on purpose hurts like seeing a child hurt. But then, I remembered Adama. Her look. And her question, "You are what you dream, right?" That day, I didn't give a speech. I didn't call a meeting. I just sat with the elders in silence. They taught me something powerful: what is burned with hatred is reborn with twice the strength. And there, amidst ashes and tears, we decided we will rebuild. And not with the same materials, but with even more truth. The news spread. And the people's response was beyond anything I could have imagined. Children began sending letters with drawings of what they had lost. Musicians composed new songs. Women braided their hair with symbols of resistance. And then I saw it: they wanted to silence us, but they gave us even more of a voice. Those responsible were never officially identified. But we knew. And the world knew. The attack was not just physical. It was spiritual. It was a message: stay where you belong. But we no longer had a place. Because the space we now occupied was internal. It was historic. It was non-negotiable. We decided to create the memorial of the burnt word. A place where no images would be displayed. Only sounds. Whispers, recordings, the sound of fire, the laughter of children. A temple of sound to remember that even when our books are erased, our voices carry on. And sometimes, they scream even louder. In that burning silence, we sealed something greater than a reconstruction. We made a pact with time: we will never be silent again. And we will never let them erase our songs again. Years have passed. Much has changed. Governments have fallen, treaties have been revised, maps have been redrawn. But the most important thing is what hasn't changed. The network lives on. The song continues to be taught. Adama has grown. And I continue to tend the fire, as I promised that night in Accra. I did not become a myth. I did not want to be a symbol. I simply remained. With mistakes, with doubts, but with a loyalty that is not negotiable. And today, when people ask me what was most important to me, I do not talk about the decrees. Or the programs. I talk about listening. Of looking into the eyes. Of kneeling before a child and saying, "It all begins with you." Obama never came back. But sometimes I get letters from him. Short ones. Direct ones. Once he simply wrote, "The seed became soil." And I understood. Because what we planted is no longer an idea. It is soil. It is roots. It is people living with their heads held high and their spirits free. Today, there are schools where there used to be ruins. There are dances where there used to be silence. And there is a new language being born, made of truth, memory, and hope. A language that is not learned in books, but in the blood. And when it is spoken, the world listens, even if it does not understand. Sometimes I sit under the same baobab tree where we first met. I listen to the wind. And in it, I hear voices. Voices that came before me. And that will come after. Because the fight is not mine. Nor is it ours. It belongs to time. And time is finally on our side. If you've made it this far, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the stories that the world still tries to hide. This story is not about leaders. It's about you. About what you choose to dream, to sustain, to sing. Because maybe one day, someone will look at you and ask, "You are what you dream, right?" And in that moment, destiny can change. Take care of the fire. Always.